Now that we understand Israel's role as Yahweh's treasured covenant partner who represents him among the nations, we're ready to talk about the most famous event at Sinai, the giving of the Ten Commandments. Everybody knows that Moses comes down the mountain with 2 tablets. But why? Was one the rough draft? Did these 10 commands not fit on one tablet? Does one tablet contain the commands that relate to God and the other contain commands relating to others? Here's where archaeology can help us. As it turns out, it's standard practice to make duplicate copies of a treaty, one for each party. Each party would put their copy in the most holy place of the temple in their community so that their deity would be aware of the stipulations and could ensure loyalty on both sides. When Moses came down the mountain carrying 2 stone tablets, it was an unmistakable sign that Israel was entering into a treaty as a nation. But this treaty is different. In the case of Yahweh's covenant with Israel, there's only one deity involved who can ensure covenant faithfulness of both parties. So both copies were placed in the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place of Yahweh's temple. The term Decalogue is another name for the 10 Commandments. Deca means 10, and logos means word in Greek. The Decalogue is the 10 words, which is what the Bible consistently calls these commands. Each word is, of course, more than a single word. It's an item on the list. But you might be surprised to learn that there's disagreement over how to count the 10 Commandments. They aren't numbered in the text, and different traditions divide between the commands in different places. My book lays out a fuller argument for the reasons why, but I count as number 1 the command not to worship other gods. Included in this first command is the prohibition of making idols. In the ancient world, idols and worship went hand in hand. You would not make an idol unless your intention was to worship it, and you could not worship other gods without having an idol. Conceptually, idols and worship belong together. They also belong together grammatically. Notice that in Exodus 20 verse 3, the word gods is plural. They were not to have other gods. In verse 4, they are not to make an image, singular. But in verse 5, God says, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them," which is plural again. Verse 5 follows the command against idol making that many people take as rule number 2. But on its own, it's incoherent. The command not to bow down to them points back to the plural word gods in verse 3. Conceptually and grammatically, these instructions are bound together as one word or command. Rule number 1 is to worship only Yahweh. Rule number 2 is widely assumed to prohibit using God's name as a swear word. I don't think that's what it's about. I spent 5 years studying this command from every possible angle. The Hebrew reads, "You shall not carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain." The word I've translated as carry is the Hebrew word nasa. It can mean lift up or bear or carry. Most translators have assumed that carry the name must be a figurative way of referring to speaking God's name. But nasa only refers to speech in cases where there are extra speech-related clues in the context, such as lips, voice, say, cry out. No such clues appear in this command. But if we look in the immediate context at Sinai, we find a different interpretive key. Someone else at Sinai is said to carry names. It's the high priest. On his breastpiece are 12 precious stones engraved with names, 1 stone for each tribe. In Exodus 28:29, the high priest is said to carry the names of the sons of Israel on his person as he moves about the tabernacle. Moses' brother Aaron, who becomes Israel's first high priest, literally carries these tribal names whenever he's on duty. It's his vocation to represent all 12 tribes before Yahweh. Aaron also wears a name on his forehead, the name Yahweh. Tied to his turban is a gold medallion engraved with the words, "Holy belonging to Yahweh." It's just 2 words in Hebrew, Kodesh LeYahweh. The L in front of Yahweh's name is the customary way of indicating ownership. With Yahweh on his forehead, it's clear that the high priest is set apart for service to Yahweh. He belongs exclusively to Yahweh. It's also his vocation to represent Yahweh to the 12 tribes. So what does this have to do with the name command? Think back to the dramatic declaration of Exodus 19, when Israel first arrived at Mount Sinai. There, God bestowed titles on his people like treasured possession, kingdom of priests, holy nation. As his treasured possession, Israel's vocation, the thing they were meant to do, is to represent their God to the rest of humanity. They function in priestly ways, mediating between Yahweh and everyone else. They are set apart for his service. We can see how this connects to the high priest. He is a visual model of the vocation of the entire nation. Just as the high priest represents Yahweh to them, so they represent Yahweh to the nations. By looking at Aaron, every Israelite is reminded of their calling as a nation. Just as he is set apart for service, so are they. In fact, in Moses' last sermon before his death, in Deuteronomy 7:6, he calls them a people Kodesh LeYahweh. What is true of the high priest is true of them as well. At Sinai, Yahweh claims this nation as his very own and releases them to live out their calling. That calling is to bear Yahweh's name among the nations, that is, to represent him well. Do you see how this is so much bigger than how people say God's name? Other nations are watching Israel to find out what Yahweh is like. Thus, they are told not to carry his name in vain. If they claim to be Yahweh's people and yet live no differently than their neighbors, they will bear this name in vain. This is the heart of my book. God's people bear God's name. They belong to him and represent him among the nations. Together, the first two commands echo the covenant formula: I will be your God and you will be my people. Number 1, worship only Yahweh. Number 2, represent him well. The entire list of 10 commands functions as what Daniel Block calls a bill of other people's rights. Living by these rules ensures that everyone has a right to rest, a right to life, a right to property, a right to an untarnished reputation, a right to exclusive marriage. Parents are honored. Can you see why these commands are such good news? If everyone lived this way, we would have such harmony. In the next session, we'll look at the consequences of not following these 10 commands.